Imagine a small country nestled right there on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. For centuries, it's been known for this incredibly rich tapestry of cultures, a place where people from all sorts of different backgrounds somehow coexisted.
Hmm.
But this same land has also been, well, a flashpoint. It's faced immense challenges, conflict, external pressures for millennia. How can one, relatively small patch of Earth hold such a vast, complex, and often difficult history?
It really is a paradox, isn't it? Forged by geography and history. This unique spot, it's always been a crossroads, attracting different peoples, different powers,
Yeah.
and that's left, well, an indelible mark.
Absolutely. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a close look at Lebanon, a
Mhm.
country that truly embodies that whole idea of being a historical and geographical crossroads.
Yeah, and our guide for this exploration is A Brief History of Lebanon by Associate Professor Dr. Afisavad Chayapolfet Sirivatanawardachara. This source gives us a really sweeping view from deep ancient history right up to the complex challenges Lebanon faces today.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack those layers. We want to try and understand the fundamental forces that shaped modern Lebanon, from the powerful ancient civilizations that first thrived there, the empires that left their mark.
And the internal dynamics, too.
Right, the unique internal dynamics that developed, and of course, the crises of the recent past and present. We really want to help you grasp what's most important about this incredibly resilient and, yeah, complex place.
Okay, so let's dive in. We should probably start right at the beginning, because the land itself, well, it tells the first part of the story.
Yeah, the source really highlights just how ancient Lebanon's roots are. Its geography, the mix of coasts, mountains, forests, fertile valleys, it just made it attractive to settlers way back into prehistoric times even. It was kind of naturally positioned to be a hub.
And this prime location, it fostered the growth of some of the most ancient, historically significant cities in the whole region. Places like Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, Baalbek, Tripoli. These names resonate through history.
And from this setting emerged, well, a truly groundbreaking civilization. The Phoenicians, the source describes them as the first civilized nation there, and they dominated Mediterranean trade and culture, between about 1200 and 600 BC?
Yeah, roughly. And their contribution to human civilization is just profound. The source notes they were among the first to use papyrus for writing material, and probably most famously, the world's oldest alphabet, discovered in Byblos.
Wow.
Yeah, they were
Wow.
master mariners,
Yeah.
traders. They utilized those famous cedar forests, timbers, so prized that Egyptian pharaohs actually imported them for their grand building projects.
That commercial energy was so clearly fueled by their geography. They were, I think the source calls them purveyors of civilization, right? Spreading knowledge and goods all through the Mediterranean. They set up colonies far and wide, trading these sought-after products like their famous purple dye, glass, textiles, and yeah, of course, timber.
And their society wasn't just about trade. They had complex religious systems, legal codes written on papyrus, and animal skin. They pursued knowledge across fields like grammar, history, astronomy, medicine, architecture, philosophy. The source even gives us a little glimpse into their daily lives, mentions their simple huts made from local stuff like branches and reeds.
So the geography completely shaped their livelihoods, their culture. The mountains, like Cornet al Sada, they influenced the climate. That fertile Bekaa Valley became this natural passage for trade and, well, armies too, between the coast and the interior. Rivers like the Litani and Adonis served as routes or sometimes, natural boundaries.
And all this wealth and strategic location, well, it inevitably drew the attention of the bigger land-based empires. Rome eventually conquered Phoenicia in 64 BC.
Right, and the reason was purely strategic, wasn't it? Rome needed control of the grain supply coming up from Egypt, and that coastline was just essential for facilitating trade routes.
Exactly. The Romans built impressive infrastructure, too. Things like the Via Maris Road connecting the coastal cities, and they established strategic towns both on the coast and inland. You can still see their distinctive colonial architectural style in some places.
The Romans were also interested in Lebanon's resources, particularly the timber. They encouraged agriculture, olives, grapes, cereals, and built aqueducts to support their cities. But yeah, their most visible legacy today has got to be their monumental architecture.
Oh, absolutely, especially at Baalbek. I mean, the scale of those Roman temples,
Yes.
dedicated to figures like Jupiter, Bacchus, Venus, it's just breathtaking. It's this blend of Greek and Roman religious traditions.
Hmm.
And the source tells us Roman craftsmen While they initially kind of stuck to their own styles, eventually they started incorporating local materials and techniques. You can see it in details, like the banded drums on the Temple of Bacchus.
Mm.
And there were other Roman temples scattered across Mount Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley too, really underscoring their widespread influence.
And it was during this Roman period that Christianity began to really take root. By the early 3rd century AD, you had organized Christian communities in coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon, and they started spreading inland. Mount Lebanon, influenced by nearby Baalbek, which was called Heliopolis, then also saw the faith grow.
Yeah, and as Christianity gained prominence, well, the pagan temples were actively dismantled. That grand complex at Baalbek, for instance, it was later quarried for building materials for churches and mosques.
Right, so the Roman period lasted, nearly 4 centuries, shaping the region's religious architectural landscape before their influence started to wane around the 4th century AD.
Which brings us neatly into the medieval era, a time of shifting power and new influences, particularly with the arrival of the Crusaders.
Yeah, the source places this starting around the 11th century when the Seljuk Turks took control of Palestine and parts of Lebanon. And that really set the stage for the Crusades, didn't it? From about 1096 to 1291, launched by European powers aiming to, secure control of the Holy Lands.
The early Crusades were pretty successful along the Lebanese coast. They led to the capture of key cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Tripoli. The capture of Tripoli in 1104, that was a big deal, given its long history as a major city.
It's interesting, though, the source notes that while the Crusaders were very active on the coast, cities like Baalbek and Beirut weren't really primary military targets.
Well, Baalbek was far inland, separated by mountains, and neither really posed a significant threat to their coastal hold, according to the source material.
Right, makes sense.
But despite that initial success, the Crusader states faced increasing pressure from a consolidating Muslim front. Saladin and his Ayyubid successors eventually pushed back, driving out Crusader central authority from much of northern, western, and eastern Lebanon by the late 12th century.
And this fragmentation of power, it had a really lasting impact. It allowed local noblemen, particularly the Druze aristocracy, to kind of solidify their authority in the highlands and mountains, often operating outside the strictures of Islamic Sharia law.
Exactly. And the source suggests this environment fostered the reemergence of a distinct Lebanese culture, increasing its linguistic and cultural differences from other parts of Syria.
So those distinctions were already starting to form.
They were deepening, yeah. Eventually, the Crusader strongholds along the coast fell to the Mamluks, coming up from Egypt. Tripoli fell in 1289, and Mamluk control then extended across the Levant after they defeated the Ottomans further south, cutting off Ottoman roots and basically making the Mamluks the dominant power in the region.
The source describes the early Mamluk era as bringing, a degree of prosperity. Commerce flourished, apparently, and there was investment in public works like bridges, water systems. Their rule also introduced new architectural styles and saw a cultivation of Muslim arts.
True, but Mamluk rule also led to some pretty significant shifts in trade patterns. They actively suppressed the commercial influence of European traders, specifically targeting Sicilian and Venetian commerce in places like Saida and Jebel. So while inland centers in cities like Tripoli and Sur continued to thrive as maritime hubs connecting to Egypt, Beirut actually saw a decline as a major port compared to its rivals. It became more associated with fishing, though it was still there, of course.
So this long period of Mamluk control and then the rise of another vast empire, this is all laying more groundwork for Lebanon's really unique path.
Indeed. Lebanon came under the control of the Ottoman Empire in 1516, and that rule would last for nearly 4 centuries, a huge chunk of time.
And here's where we see a dynamic that really shaped Lebanon's future identity. Unlike many other parts of the, vast Ottoman Empire, the mountainous core of Lebanon experienced relatively little direct Ottoman interference.
Right. This relative autonomy, it allowed the local Druze aristocracy to maintain and consolidate their power as a ruling elite. And crucially, it also provided enough space for the Maronite Christian community to develop their own institutions and take on an increasingly prominent role.
And this, the source argues, is where the foundations for Lebanon's later confessional power-sharing system were really laid. Although, as we'll see, this internal dynamic would later be, exploited by external powers.
The period wasn't without its challenges, of course. Regional powers like Egypt and the growing Emirate of Mount Lebanon were significant players. The source mentions the complex political landscape from, say, 1570 to 1760, with various dynasties vying for control in the wider region. And while this sometimes led to interconfessional peace within Lebanon, It also sowed seeds of future conflict because of the lack of consistent governance and growing socioeconomic problems.
Hmm. The Ottoman appointment of the Druze Emirate, it did initially bring about a century of relative prosperity, didn't it? But then a combination of external pressures, internal issues, it eventually led to a severe famine in the early 19th century. And an unsuccessful revolt against Ottoman authority just resulted in increased direct control from Constantinople.
Yeah, the Ottoman administrative structure in the region was quite layered. You had the provincial level with a governor appointed by the Sultan, then these administrative divisions overseen by local figures or pashas, and finally, a significant degree of local autonomy in rural areas where village councils, elected by residents, managed local affairs largely independently of central authority.
This decentralized structure really contributed to the power of local elites, didn't it? Coercive state functions were mainly aimed at maintaining central control, but the ruling elite and the state became, well, interdependent. They cooperated on things like controlling communication and trade, enforcing regulations, justice, collecting taxes, doing censuses.
And wealthy families, traditional elites, they often dominated economic resources. This led to significant inequality in competing centers of power. These elites skillfully used their wealth and, crucially, their kinship networks to build these vast clientelistic systems, essentially networks of patronage and personal loyalty, which help maintain social order, but also their own position, sometimes at the expense of broader development.
So, the Ottoman era is just key because it allowed this unique pattern of confessional autonomy and elite power structures to emerge, especially in Mount Lebanon, really setting the stage for the modern state.
Which leads us right into the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the transition to the French Mandate period after World War I.
Yeah, the source mentions the Sykes-Picot Agreement sort of setting the context for the region. After the Ottoman defeat, France was granted a mandate over Syria and Lebanon.
And the source touches on events leading up to this, difficult conditions imposed by the Ottomans in 1914, British wartime propaganda against the Ottomans, even air raids on Beirut. British and Free French forces took control of Lebanese areas, reportedly based on a promise to France to reestablish Lebanese independence and allow for French settlement.
Right, so Palestine became a British mandate, while the territory designated for Lebanon initially without its southern parts, it seems, came under French control.
And under this mandate regime, from 1920 until independence, there was a very deliberate effort to define a clearer national identity for this new entity. Political power, preferential treatment. It was heavily influenced by the French, who tended to favor the Maronite Christian community and the traditional landowning elites, especially those from Mount Lebanon, who had thrived under Ottoman autonomy.
A really pivotal decision by the WWI victors was the creation of Greater Lebanon in 1920. This involved expanding the territory of the former Mount Lebanon administrative area to include coastal cities, parts of the Bekaa Valley, going against previous Ottoman boundaries.
Yeah, and the source points out that unlike many nations formed through, say, popular movements or conquest, Lebanon was essentially handed over to foreign rule via the mandate. There was a clear demand in 1920 to protect the rights of all populations in the mandated territories, but particularly the Maronites and Druze in Lebanon.
This expansion, it was welcomed by some Maronite elites in Beirut who saw it as securing their position, right? But it faced resistance from the predominantly Muslim populations in those coastal cities who, historically, identified more closely with Syria.
Exactly. So the birth of modern Lebanon in 1920, with the French granting this expanded territory and political preference to certain allied elites, the source views it as both the culmination of a drive for independence against Ottoman policies, but also a deepening of those internal divisions between groups with different regional identities.
So even after the French withdrew, following Lebanon's independence in 1943 and the signing of the National Pact, the source notes that the structure set up during the colonial period and that unresolved question of Lebanon's relationship with its Arab identity, they remained, quote, pestering threads in the fabric of unity, continuing to cause tension.
Yeah, it definitely sets the stage for the challenges the newly independent state faced almost immediately.
So in November 1945, you get a provisional government led by President Bashar al-Khoury taking the reins. They're working to establish full state control over administration, military finances, customs, integrating institutions like the judiciary, treasury into the new structure.
And a new constitutional assembly was elected. Building on earlier frameworks, a constitution was finalized and signed on May 23, 1926, formally establishing that confessional system that would really define Lebanese politics moving forward.
This system was quite specific, wasn't it? Trying to balance power among the main religious sects. The presidency, reserved for a Maronite Christian. The Council of Ministers. The source notes it was intended to have 15 members with a specific religious breakdown, although the numbers provided in the text for some sects don't quite add up to 15 when you list them out. But the core principle was representation across confession.
Right, that was the idea. And the Assembly of Representatives was designed with proportional representation based on a 6.5 ratio favoring Christians over Muslims, with 55 members at that time. An independent judiciary was also part of this structure, on paper at least.
Bishara Curry, a Maronite nationalist figure, he became the first president under this new system. Influential leaders from various communities were brought into the government. The assembly president, Khaled al-Bari, advocated for sovereignty and independence, but also alongside ideas of Arab federation or unity, which kind of reflects the diverse views within the new nation.
Early foreign policy saw Lebanon maintaining pretty close ties with the West, particularly Britain and France. Al-Bari notably rejected a full federation with Syria, seeking non-aggression pacts with other Arab states instead. But the broader, fluid political landscape of the Middle East, with all these competing forms of nationalism and loyalties, it made establishing unquestioned national stability pretty difficult.
Yeah, the source points out a really crucial vulnerability right from the start. While the new order aimed to preserve peace, independence, sovereignty, the actual terms of the Lebanese fraternity were surprisingly thin. There wasn't really deep common ground or agreement on the fundamental details of belonging. Political elites focused on their own spheres rather than building a truly unified national identity, meaning the state's institutions rested on, well, limited foundations.
Right. So despite the official birth of the nation through territory and state structures, the source argues that fully adopting the national choice made in 1943 required political accommodation of a type that had never been carried out before. Without a really concerted effort to manage and curb differences, the risk of internal conflict was, frankly, high.
The source suggests international support was seen as necessary to navigate these internal tensions. Maybe even security support coming from outside the immediate Arabs' cultural arena to be effective. Despite the inherent challenges, Lebanese statesmen did attempt to balance political, military, economic, social needs, though initial policy success was, let's say, partial.
There's a fascinating paradox noted about the French Mandate period, though. While it was perceived as an imposition, the French role as a patron of Lebanese independence, ironically, may have prevented the country from being potentially absorbed back into intra-Arab rivalries or collapsing into immediate domestic upheaval.
Ah, that's interesting.
The source calls it a strange and involuntary birth, but one that, according to the elites at the time, aligned with a Western liberal model of a pluralist society and a hedged market economy.
But these fragile foundations, the embedded confessional system, the lack of deep national consensus, ultimately they proved unable to withstand the mounting pressures, didn't they?
No, they didn't. And the source structure moves directly from this point to discussing the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted from 1975 to 1990. Now, while the source outline includes sections for causes, major events, consequences, the actual text provided for this deep dive doesn't detail the specific events of the war itself.
Right. Okay. So the text acknowledges the immense devastation and impact of this conflict, notes it was sparked by intersectarian tensions that were, instrumentalized by political factions, and that it escalated rapidly with significant regional and international intervention. But it doesn't walk us through the battles or specific turning points.
Exactly. The source focuses more on the post-war period and the attempts to resolve the conflict, particularly the logic of Civil War revocation agreements. It highlights the Taif Agreement as really central to this.
The Taif Agreement, signed in 1989. The subsequent dialogues around its implementation. The source suggests these negotiations reveal a fragile role for Lebanon and the Lebanese in determining their own future. There's even a provocative claim made in the text that a minimal Lebanon was acceptable, even essential, to allow the political economy and power of the Syrian-Lebanese economic elite to expand regionally.
Yeah, and it includes that extraordinary assertion that the Taif Agreement was reportedly written for the first time in a language other than Arabic in Afghanistan and implemented elsewhere to weaken opposition. That really speaks to the complexity and suspicion surrounding its origins and intent.
Wow, that's quite a claim.
It is. The source describes the post-war Lebanese state as fundamentally changed. It shifted from an earlier model, that perhaps understood the need for patron-client networks to what it calls a contrived state, lacking deep legitimacy and seemingly trying to bypass the necessity of those traditional networks, although patronage absolutely remained crucial.
So the pre-war system was heavily sectarian, and while Lebanon didn't completely disintegrate during the war, this system was effectively recreated afterwards, maybe inefficiently, despite changing external conditions. The source kind of pushes back against the idea that failures were solely due to sectarianism in the 1980s, suggesting other factors were at play.
Hmm. On the economic front after the war, the source briefly mentions the massive reconstruction efforts initiated by figures like Rafik Hariri. While this became a symbol of rebuilding, it was, according to the source, accompanied by renewed external and internal tensions, often involving the very same political actors who were prominent before the war.
Right, so building on that complex post-war period and the structures it solidified, let's look at the challenges Lebanon faces, in the 21st century.
Okay, the source reminds us of the foundation. The 1926 Constitution, establishing a parliamentary republic with separation of powers, and the 1943 National Pact, based on coexistence and power sharing. It's formally defined as a civil state, separation of state and religion, meant to be a model of coexistence and shared governance.
Yeah, meant to be. Yet, the reality, as described by the source, is quite different. The four main state institutions, government, parliament, presidency, judiciary, along with ministries,
Yeah.
civil law, they're deeply intertwined with religious sects.
This is a really key point the source makes. State institutions are effectively co-administered by these religious sects and their associated political parties. Patronage, particularly in appointing staff across the entire state apparatus, is overwhelmingly sectarian.
So the political leaders are the sectarian leaders.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
The source is quite blunt about that. And this creates this peculiar system where, for example, despite demographic shifts, the president is always Maronite Christian, the prime minister Sunni Muslim, reflecting this competitive allocation of roles rather than just simple demographic proportion.
And Lebanon's vulnerabilities, they stem from this complex mix of internal and external factors. The source identifies the main internal issues, the lingering bitterness from the civil war, obviously, the deeply embedded sectarianism, systemic corruption at all levels, and a deformed economic structure lacking real development.
Civil society, while it exists, is described as uneven and fragmented, with an unclear role in peace building. It includes both secular and religious groups, often struggling with identity. And the source notes that many sectarian leaders, perhaps wary of a unified Lebanese entity that might dilute their power, engage in international activism, lobbying foreign governments, seeking external support.
Which paradoxically often deepens the internal sectarian divides.
Precisely. Governance itself is characterized by fragmentation. The post-war agreements solidify the right of each sect to power share, but in exchange for what the source calls ambiguous commitments to broader national goals like secularism or social justice. The state is controlled by sectarian identity parties operating in a segmented operating mode, where different groups kind of control their own pieces of the state apparatus.
Different interpretations of TIFE serving self-interest.
Exactly. And crucially, political patronage insidiously undermines any checks and balances that might theoretically exist.
Economically, the picture painted by the source is pretty bleak. The economy has this pre-industrial structure, largely excluded from cohesive development policy. Instead of a concrete plan, you get these elusive visions of being a unique Libanization model or a liberal haven. A major external vulnerability was the country's deep integration into regional and global financial markets, which happened back in the mid-1990s.
And by late 2017, due to a mix of internal and external factors, the economy just collapsed into the deepest depression in modern history, leading to a sovereign debt default.
This economic crisis is obviously tied to broader political instability. Lebanon is described as a politically weak state, often a victim of geopolitical shifts in the Middle East, partly due to its geography. Small size, no significant natural resources, those existing internal divisions, and powerful neighbors with complex, often controversial agendas. Israel, Palestinian Authority dynamics, Syria.
And the large presence of Palestinian refugees, plus Hezbollah's role in the Israeli-Arab conflict, further underscore Lebanon's deep regional entanglement.
Regional geopolitics profoundly impact Lebanon. It's often seen as a satellite state or a playground for foreign powers to exert influence. Events in Syria, the survival of the Assad regime, the activities of groups like Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS have direct consequences for Lebanon. The source does suggest that a potential future balance of power between regional rivals like Iran and Saudi Arabia could potentially normalize some of these tensions.
The source argues that the fundamental cause of Lebanon's recent fragmentation, or potential disintegration, is the confrontation between Shiite and Sunni factions since 2005, mirroring regional divisions. It refers to a Lewinsky crisis, a term the source uses, not us, to describe this unraveling based on the weak post-Taif consensus and the denationalization of the ethnic conflict, linking Lebanon's internal issues to four specific regional crises whose resolution is critical for Lebanon's stability.
Economic hardship was significantly worse after the Syrian civil war started in March 2011. That immediately halted previous periods of rapid growth. The humanitarian crisis in Syria severely impacted Lebanon's economy and social conditions. And the source notes it's hard to disentangle the broader costs of the regional conflict from the specific costs of hosting displaced Syrians.
Yeah, Lebanon had to adapt its economic patterns to accommodate the influx. Traditional export markets were disrupted, although some businesses did benefit from supplying humanitarian aid into Syria. Tourism definitely suffered due to increased risk perception. Unemployment spiked, particularly with the arrival of low-skilled Syrian labor. Investor confidence plummeted, credit ratings downgraded, borrowing costs went up.
And beyond the Syrian crisis impact, internal factors like political deadlock, that sovereign default, they just added to the economic woes.
The Syrian civil war created this massive humanitarian crisis, millions displaced. Lebanon became a major host country for refugees alongside Jordan, Turkey, Iraq.
Right, and Lebanon took that unique approach, the no-camp policy, resulting in over 600 informal settlements across the country, largely without government supervision or assistance. That added immense pressure to an already densely populated country facing its own economic and political crises. The number of Syrian migrant workers increased dramatically, many arriving illegally, facing difficult conditions, though initial entry was easier after the crisis began. The source estimates maybe 500,000 working-age Syrian refugees are currently in Lebanon.
So, given this incredibly deep history, these overwhelming modern challenges, where does the source actually see Lebanon heading? What are the prospects?
Well, the initial picture is quite grim, frankly. The current state is widely seen as a failure marked by mediocrity, incompetence, endemic corruption. There's a deep sense of helplessness, hopelessness across the population. The source states 80% live in poverty with very low incomes.
Yeah, the economy is described as ravaged.
Yeah.
Capital flight, bankrupt banks, hyperinflation, soaring unemployment, persistent corruption, a severe lack of basic infrastructure, basic services. State authority is said to be almost non-existent outside of Beirut, leaving most of the country vulnerable to other influences.
The source identifies Hezbollah as the most powerful entity, with what it calls almost uninhibited control of the executive branch. Yet, despite this power concentration, the country is perceived as too broken for anyone to effectively govern. It leads to political paralysis, where negotiations, decision-making, they're constantly stalled.
And the difficulty in even distinguishing clearly between ruling elites and the opposition reflects that widespread disillusionment and outrage.
Yeah. The source is critical of the political discourse, too, calling it shallow, conventional. A rhetorical, kind of disconnected form of discussion has gained legitimacy. The source sees the pursuit of a balanced mediocrity brokered by outside actors as a morbid expression of fatalism.
It suggests opposing the status quo often means inadvertently opposing the foreign powers who back the existing elites.
Exactly. The concept of legitimacy itself seems diluted, undermining accountability, representation. The source concludes this section pretty starkly. All notions of future are lost, leading to despair and hopelessness.
Oof, that's heavy. However, despite this bleak assessment, the source does highlight potential avenues for reform, for positive change. It emphasizes Lebanon's unique cultural heritage, its pluralism. There's a sense that people are starting to question those traditional feudal loyalties, seeking more agency in shaping their own future.
Younger Lebanese are described as highly civilized and worldly, potentially bringing valuable perspectives from other countries that have dealt with corruption.
There's also a still fledgling civil society that's increasingly aware of democratic goals, and the media is seen as more vibrant, more active in pushing for accountability.
And the withdrawal of Syria's military presence is presented as a significant, maybe rare opportunity to craft a new Lebanon that can truly integrate its historical, multicultural mosaic, the diverse patchwork of religions, histories, languages. It's seen as a potential strength, enabling an ongoing experimentation with the new societal contract between state and citizen.
Reformation is framed as an awakening towards the idea of a Lebanon for all. But the political culture remains divided, doesn't it? Between those aspiring for democracy aligned with universal standards and those seeking to pull the state in a more tyrannical or regionally defined direction.
Yeah. The source touches on the broader trajectory of Middle Eastern politics, seeing a potential path towards democracy, or, conversely, towards Wahhabism, used here to describe a more extreme religious conservatism. There was hope for positive change after Syria's withdrawal and the emergence of a stronger government under Hariri and Lahoud. But the source warns that without a proactive Lebanese or broader Arab reform agenda, extreme elements might seek to retaliate against the open spaces of pluralism through attempts to absorb Lebanese distinctiveness.
One of the most compelling points about potential change, I think, focuses on the role of youth, particularly in the context of the 2019 October Revolution. This generation, roughly 18 to 40, they grew up under the post-Civil War state, and according to the source, they fundamentally reject the existing political class, their perceived subservience to external powers like Iran, and the failing state institutions. They're just fed up.
Fed up with the sectarianism, the corruption, the mismanagement that has defined their lives, they're ready to protest.
Yeah, they're described as children of the Lebanese war, but not its products. They emphasize they didn't fight in that war. They feel they inhabit another reality. They explicitly reject the language and rhetoric of the traditional politicians, preferring instead the language of revolutions and of grassroots changes.
They assert their right to choose their own identity, often feeling like hybrids, chameleons, skeptical of the fixed identities offered post-war. Crucially, they take sectarianism for granted in a different way, believing religion is a private matter and not a matter of the state.
This generation is portrayed as brave, accepting risks. Their focus isn't on old alignments like pro-West or pro-middle class, but on a different kind of collective identity, new us versus real us. The source notes that in the early 2010s, they began pushing for reform, sometimes perceived as naively entering the political maelstrom.
Unlike earlier activists who had mentors, this generation, the source says, believes they can dispense with wisdom from the past. They've engaged in efforts like opening libraries, archives, using humor, comic sketches to critique their society.
They believe they can expose the hidden truths, the failures of the state. And while they might have expected older generations to resist them rigidly, they found instead that their elders often just clung to outdated ways of thinking. It's a generation actively pushing back against that immense weight of history.
So we've really journeyed through millennia of history here, from the groundbreaking seafaring Phoenicians, the monumental scale of the Romans, through shifting control under Crusaders, Mamluks, the long Ottoman era, fostering that unique local autonomy which planted seeds for the confessional system.
The complex French mandate drawing the borders of the modern state, the turbulent challenges of independence with its fragile power-sharing pact.
The devastating Civil War, at least in terms of its impact and the resolution attempts the source describes, and the ongoing struggles of the 21st century. Deep internal divisions, economic collapse, persistent external pressures. It's a lot.
It's undeniably clear that Lebanon's identity has always been this vibrant but often strained mosaic. Shaped by its unique geography, the diverse cultures interacting over centuries, and that constant negotiation and often conflict between powerful internal groups and external forces seeking influence.
So as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe think about how the sheer weight of such a long and turbulent history inevitably shapes the present day and profoundly influences the path forward.
Yeah, and maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given that our source describes a state so deeply hobbled by internal divisions and external manipulation, yet it also highlights this new generation explicitly rejecting the old ways, striving for a Lebanon for all. How does that deep-seated history of external influence and internal fragmentation truly impact the potential for that younger generation to forge a fundamentally different future? What specific forces from the past, the confessional system, the clientelism, the external dependencies, pose the most significant obstacles for them to overcome?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of Lebanon.